the shadow in the hallway. Last night, I experienced something I can't explain. Something that has left me questioning if I'm safe in my own home. It all began around 2 a.m. when I was lying in bed, scrolling mindlessly on my phone. The soft glow of the screen was the only light in the room, and everything else was deathly silent. That's when I heard it. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps in the hallway. I live alone. A cold dread washed over me as I froze, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. The silence that followed was unbearable, each second stretching into eternity. Summoning every ounce of courage I could muster, I whispered, "Hello?" No response. Then, the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, deliberately. My heart thundered in my chest as I scrambled out of bed and grabbed the first object within reach, a lamp. My hands trembled as I stood there, waiting, poised to strike. But the door didn't open. Instead, a faint scratching sound began. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it quickly became more distinct. A deliberate scraping, like nails or claws dragging across the wood. The sound sent shivers racing down my spine. Summoning what little bravery I had left, I crept toward the door. My breath hitched as I leaned forward, my eye aligning with the tiny keyhole. At first, all I saw was darkness, an endless void staring back at me. But then, something moved. A single bloodshot eye appeared on the other side of the keyhole, staring straight into mine. I screamed, stumbling backward, dropping the lamp with a loud crash. Panic consumed me, but I forced myself to act. I lunged for the door and threw it open, bracing for whatever horror awaited me. The hallway was empty. The silence returned, but this time it felt oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. My hands shook as I stood there, staring into the dark corridor, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I couldn't. And the worst part? This morning, I found deep scratches etched into the wood of my bedroom door. My brother. This happened in the 70s, just outside Philly, during a time when we Gen X kids spent every waking moment on our bikes. We rode through trails, built forts, and traveled to malls, blowing rolls of quarters at arcades. One hot summer day, outside a Kmart, my brother, who was 10 at the time, just a year older than me, was approached by a greasy-looking man with long hair and a beard, driving a beat-up station wagon. The man asked my brother for directions and offered him $10, a lot of money for kids our age, if he would hop in, put his bike in the trunk, and show him around town. Wanting to get in on the action, I chimed in, saying he couldn't take my brother unless I came along and got another $10. My best friend, eager not to be left out, made the same demand. Apparently, the idea of taking 3 kids was more than the man bargained for, because he suddenly sped off. A week later, his face was plastered all over the local news. He had been arrested for abducting another young boy and assaulting him on the same day he approached us. Looking back, it chills me to think how close we came to being victims of a convicted predator. At the time, we didn't even consider the danger. All we could think about was the money, oblivious to how reckless and unsafe the situation really was. Skinwalker in the woods. I never thought my fears of the supernatural would actually come true, but it happened. My friend Dave lives in a remote area with no neighbors for miles. He's always claimed that skinwalkers haunt the woods around his house, and his whole family believes it. When I went to visit him, I didn't take his warning seriously. At least, not at first. On the first day I was there, we spent the day training outside, and everything seemed normal. That night, however, things took a turn. Around 10 p.m., we went outside to take out the trash. As we talked, I suddenly heard a loud snap, followed by something falling. The sound of leaves crunching made my heart race. I turned toward the hill, only about 10 feet away from where Dave and I were standing, and that's when I saw it. A pale, white, and impossibly skinny creature was lying in the leaves. As it slowly got up, it dislocated its own shoulder blades with an audible pop. I was frozen in fear. It stared directly at me for what felt like an eternity. 5 solid seconds. Then, instinct kicked in. I ran as fast as I could toward the house, fueled by every bit of cardio training I'd ever done. Dave, however, just stood there, staring at it. The next day, while exploring the area, we found a broken booby trap that had been set to catch animals. It was only 2 feet away from where I had seen the creature. On the second night, we stayed in Dave's room, trying to keep our nerves in check. Late into the night, we heard it. A screech, something I can only describe as inhuman and unnatural. It sent chills down my spine. Dave seemed unfazed and said, "Do not be afraid. It feeds on fear." I tried my best to stay calm, but the sound haunted me for the rest of the night. On the third and final day, Dave told me about an area in the woods he believed was connected to the Skinwalker. He described it as a sort of portal or strange energy hotspot. We decided to check it out. When we arrived, the area was blocked off by fallen trees. It was eerie, to say the least. We stood there, staring at the blocked-off path, when suddenly, everything around us went silent. No wind, no animals, not even the sound of falling leaves. The silence was deafening. Then I saw it again, farther in the distance. Both of us stood frozen, creeped out and unsure of what to do. We exchanged uneasy glances before we eventually made our way back to the house. Me and my sister. I must have been around 11 at the time, and by then it was just my sister and me living at home. My dad worked overnight shifts frequently, so that night, we were alone in the house. I remember it was very dark, probably because we'd gone to bed less than an hour before it happened. Suddenly, I was jolted awake by a strange noise. It sounded like someone rifling through something. Christmas wrapping paper, loud plastic, or maybe even tinfoil. You could hear the distinct crinkling, tearing, and rustling. My ears locked onto the sound, and my heart started to pound. Then I heard my sister yell from her room across the hall, "Stop!" She sounded angry. I'll never forget how I felt in that moment. My chest tightened, my pulse quickened, and fear clouded my thoughts as I shouted back, "That's not me!" The moment the words left my mouth, it hit me like a brick. I realized that if it wasn't me, then what or who was making that noise? As if my sister could feel my fear, the house grew unnervingly silent. I knew she'd shouted out of anger because she thought I was trying to scare her, but the instant I said it wasn't me, the fear in both of us skyrocketed. It was like a shared wave of terror hit us at the same time. For a moment, we were frozen, lying in our separate rooms, too scared to move or even breathe. Strangely, the noise stopped completely as soon as we began talking about it. The house fell into an unsettling silence that lingered until morning. We never really talked about that night again, but for weeks afterward, I was too scared to sleep in my own bed. I begged to stay in hers instead. My sister also had her own creepy story from around that time. She told me once that she'd been sitting in the living room, quietly reading a book, while I was outside playing. As she sat there, she began to hear someone tapping on the walls. At first, it was faint, but every time she looked up to see what it was, the tapping stopped. The man at my window. When I was in middle school, I started dating this guy I'll call Aiden. At first, he seemed sweet, charming even, but by the time we'd been together for 3 months, cracks were beginning to show. His sweetness turned possessive, and things only got worse from there. By the start of freshman year, After 7 months of ups and downs, I finally broke it off with him. At first, I thought that was the end of it. A couple of weeks later, we started hanging out as friends again, though I kept my distance emotionally. But even that didn't last long. Within a week, I realized I didn't want someone as toxic as Aiden in my life. Not even as a friend. I blocked him on everything and tried to move on. Fast forward a few months to winter break. It was our 3rd day off from school, and late that night, sometime between midnight and 1 a.m., Aiden started blowing up my phone. He sent text after text, begging to come over. I kept replying no over and over, but his messages became more insistent, eventually shifting to a chilling "I'm coming over." I panicked and blocked his number, thinking that would be the end of it. Exhausted, I drifted off to sleep, hoping he'd leave me alone. But around 4 a.m., I woke up to a loud, frantic pounding on my bedroom window. My heart nearly stopped. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, but the pounding continued, relentless and desperate. I mustered the courage to pull back my curtain, and there he was. Aiden. His face was pale in the glow of the streetlight, his breath fogging up the glass as he stared at me. His hair was soaked with melting snow, and his jacket looked frozen stiff. I let the curtain drop instantly and rolled back onto my bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I squeezed my eyes shut and prayed he would go away, but the pounding continued. Every few minutes, he would bang on the window again, harder each time. I could hear him muttering through the glass, but I couldn't make out the words. I stayed frozen in place, too terrified to move. What if he broke the window? What if he tried to get in? The minutes dragged by like hours. Finally, after 2 excruciating hours, the pounding stopped. I waited, barely daring to breathe. And when I finally peeked out, he was gone. What haunted me even more was the thought of what he had done to get to my house. There were at least 2 feet of snow on the ground, and it was still falling. The temperature was well below freezing, yet he had walked all the way to my house in the middle of a snowstorm. Just as I was beginning to calm down, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was from his sister. I had forgotten to block her. She was calling me crazy for not letting Aiden in. I didn't even know how to respond. I was so overwhelmed, confused, worried, and exhausted that I just put my phone down and forced myself to sleep. My apartment building. When I was around 13, my family and I lived on the first floor of a 6-story apartment building. Every time we needed to take the garbage out, we had to walk down the driveway to the garage room. It wasn't the safest area, but we were used to it. One late evening, my mom asked me and my younger brother to take out the trash. As we finished dumping the garbage, I noticed a large, cream-white truck parked near the driveway. Something about it felt off. It wasn't a place where trucks normally stopped, and the way it just sat there made my skin crawl. Wanting to get away from the truck, my brother and I made our way to the fire escape door. Just as we opened it, a man appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. He looked like he was in his early 20s, scruffy, unkempt, and with an unsettling energy about him. I tried to pull the door closed behind us, but the man jammed his foot in the gap, stopping it from shutting. Before I could react, he pulled out a locked knife. His voice was low, passive-aggressive, and chilling as he hissed, "Let me the fuck in, or I'll gut your sorry ass." I froze. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking. I couldn't think of anything else to do but let the door go. I was too terrified to fight back. The man slipped inside the building, his knife still in hand, and disappeared up the stairs. My brother and I rushed back to our apartment, bolting the door behind us. I didn't say a word to my mom. I was too scared to explain what had just happened, or what I had done. Instead, I went to my room, my heart pounding, and my mind replaying the man's words over and over. A few hours later, the whole building was in chaos. Security guards banged on our door, shouting for everyone to evacuate. We were rushed outside into the cold night, and it was only then that I learned what had happened. The man I'd let inside had broken into 2 apartments on the 3rd floor. He stabbed a gay couple in one unit and a woman in another. The details were horrifying, and I could barely process them. The upper floors, anything above the 3rd, were put on lockdown to prevent anyone else from leaving in case the man was still there. Eventually, we learned the attacker had fled through the back gate of the neighboring building, disappearing into the night. The police and security guards searched everywhere, but by then, it was too late. Even now, years later, I can't stop thinking about that night. I can't stop asking myself what would have happened if I hadn't let him in. Would he have still found another way? Would those people have been safe? Or did my moment of fear and hesitation change everything? I still carry the weight of that night. Every time I replay it in my head, I call myself the killer. I know I didn't stab anyone or commit the crime, but letting that man into the building feels like something I can never undo. I was almost taken. Growing up, my 2 cousins and I were inseparable. We were all girls, close in age, and living in the same household. The boys in our family were often favored in that old-fashioned way, where they could do no wrong, so we naturally banded together. We rarely went anywhere without each other, especially when it came to playing outside. Our home was directly across from the elementary school we attended, and sometimes we'd play there after hours when the school was closed. This was back before schools locked up all the time. On other days, we'd head to a nearby park to climb the playsets and enjoy the swings. It wasn't too far from our house, just a quick walk. This was also a time when kids could roam unsupervised, though looking back, it's clear our family was a bit neglectful. I don't remember exactly what we were talking about that day, but we were nearly at the park when a car pulled up beside us. The driver was a woman we'd never seen before. She looked friendly enough, but her words immediately threw us off. She claimed to know our grandma. She told us she lived nearby and that our grandma was worried about us. She offered us a ride home. At first, her words confused us. Why would our grandma send someone we didn't know to bring us home? Even as kids, something felt wrong. I think all 3 of us sensed it in our guts, even though we weren't the most socially aware at the time. We refused, politely at first, but the woman didn't take no for an answer. She insisted, her tone becoming increasingly frustrated. She kept saying things like, "Your grandma is worried about you. You need to come with me." The situation escalated quickly. We knew we needed to get away from her, but we were stuck on the sidewalk, with the park ahead and the school behind us. My heart was pounding as we desperately searched for a way out. Then, we spotted it. A gate leading into the schoolyard. The gate was barely noticeable, blending into the metal fencing surrounding the school grounds. Thankfully, it wasn't locked. Without hesitation, we yanked it open, slipped inside, and slammed it shut behind us. We sprinted across the schoolyard, heading for the opposite side of the grounds as fast as our legs could carry us. The fear of her following us was overwhelming. We didn't stop until we reached the bathrooms on the far side of the school. We ducked inside, locking ourselves in one of the stalls. It felt like hours passed as we waited there, too scared to make a sound. In reality, it was probably no more than 20 minutes. Finally, we got up the courage to peek out, checking to see if she had followed us. To our relief, the bathroom was completely empty. We decided it was safe to leave, though the fear hadn't quite left us. We took a long route home, avoiding the main street and the park, just in case. We were upset that we didn't get to play, like we had planned, but snacks and video games at home were enough to distract us for the rest of the day. Looking back, I wonder if we truly understood the danger we were in. At the time, we didn't tell our moms or anyone else about what had happened. It wasn't until years later that I began to piece things together. One detail still sends shivers down my spine. She offered us a ride home, but her car was heading in the opposite direction, toward the park. To get to our house, she would have had to make a U-turn on a street where U-turns were illegal. Why risk trouble with the law just to help a grandma she didn't know? It makes her story fall apart completely. The complex house. For context, I'm deaf. I wear a hearing aid and a cochlear implant, and while I can talk due to years of speech therapy, I also use sign language. This story happened when I was in 5th grade. My grandma and I had just moved into a new apartment above her boyfriend's unit in a complex house. Our apartment was small but cozy, with 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a window overlooking the driveway. The kitchen had a door that led up to a narrow attic. It seemed like a normal place at first, but that feeling didn't last long. Just a few weeks after moving in, strange things began to happen. My grandma kept an old radio on the kitchen table. It didn't work, but she liked it as a decoration. One night, I was jolted awake by a loud noise. Despite being mostly deaf, I could hear something faint but strange in my left ear. Confused, I got up and saw my grandma rushing down the hallway toward the kitchen. I followed her. When we got there, we saw the radio. The sound of static filled the room. My grandma tried turning it off, but nothing worked. She signed to me to unplug it, but when I checked, it wasn't even plugged in. We just stood there, staring in disbelief, until it stopped on its own a few minutes later. Things got stranger around Thanksgiving. My grandma and I went up to the attic to grab some Christmas decorations. The attic was cramped and dimly lit, with a tiny window overlooking the outside. It was unsettling, to say the least. There was a door on the far end of the attic, completely bolted shut. I couldn't explain why, but the air felt heavy, and I had this overwhelming feeling like something or someone was watching me. I couldn't stay up there long and hurried back down. A few days later, my grandma was at work and asked me to grab something from the attic. I was nervous, but told myself I could handle it. When I got up there, I froze. The bolted door, the one that had been securely locked, was wide open. My heart dropped. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, I suddenly heard a loud thud from behind the open door. It sounded deliberate, like something had fallen, or someone had taken a step. Fear took over, and I bolted down the stairs, locking the attic door behind me. For the next week, everything escalated. I started waking up in the middle of the night with the horrifying sensation of being held down, like invisible hands were pressing on my chest. The footsteps in the hallway grew louder, and the walls shook with loud banging. I tried to joke about it with my grandma, saying, "The ghost must know I'm deaf," but deep down, I was terrified. Things took a turn for the worse when my bed started shaking at night. At first, it was subtle, but soon it became violent, waking me up from my sleep. I was losing so much rest that I felt like a zombie during the day. Then came the breaking point. One night, I woke up to the sensation of my bed shaking harder than ever. Across the room, I had a bookshelf filled with glass dolls that my grandma had given me. As I tried to figure out what was happening, I felt something hit my face. Hard. 3 of the dolls had fallen from the shelf and landed on me. The impact left bruises that lasted for days. My grandma had her own chilling experiences. One night, she woke up to the sound of someone calling her nickname. The voice was familiar. It was her stepdad's, clear as day. He had passed away when I was only 3 years old. What shook her the most was the faint smell of his cologne lingering in the room, mixed with the aroma of coffee. It was the exact scent she associated with him when he was alive.